Hey there fellow creators, Ben here from Cinder Studios, and I'm actually just in my studio today getting ready to start a brand new painting. Two actually, I've got another one off to the side. And I was just grabbing a couple of materials I need to get started sketching out my composition. Now there was a time when I picked up a regular number 2 pencil to sketch my compositions, but I don't necessarily do that anymore. So let me explain to you today on why I switched from pencils to paint markers. Stick around. So I want to start by saying that there's nothing inherently wrong with using a regular pencil to sketch out your composition before you go into painting. It works just fine, but it does have one specific problem with it, and it's why I've gotten away from doing it over the years. And that is specifically because the graphite itself, depending on how much you use, how dark of a pencil versus how light of a pencil, you can very easily have a problem with that graphite mixing into your paint. Now if you're using a dark color, that's not necessarily a problem, but if you're doing something like a sky, which has a lot of bright, usually transparent colors, the second it touches that graphite, it just starts to be pulled in and mixed in with that paint, creating often an undesirable look. Now eventually I did get away from using a regular like number 2 or an HB pencil. I moved to using a 4H for a long time, and then I discovered paint markers. And paint markers do exactly the same concept of sketching out the composition, but without the weird hassle of having that graphite mix into the project itself. Now I can talk about this all day, and most of this is pretty self-explanatory, but I went ahead and grabbed myself a canvas board to show you guys exactly what all three of those look like side by side. Okay, so normally I would probably go for a bit different top-down perspective here. I'm kind of dodging the camera left and right a little bit, but that should be all we need for today. I've got a little angle brush here and some water. My regular acrylic paint, I've got some white, some primary cyan, and a little bit of a mixed brown that I made. And I just kind of want to go over just these little bits of the graphite area as you might do with, say, a first layer of paint. So a little bit of white. This is regular number 2 pencil or an HB. I'll come right up to those edges where I had dropped in some placeholders. Go over that sun, and you can see that immediately start to pick up into the paint a little bit. Not a lot, it's not a ton, especially if you're painting a little bit thicker, but it is noticeable. Mix in a little bit of the blue. And a little bit of that graphite picked up, not quite as much. Another problem I have too is it tends to also show through a lot more, because usually with a darker pencil, or even in the HB range, you tend to have to use a little bit more paint to cover up all of those areas. Obviously it's a little less of a concern for a lighter color, or a darker color rather, especially applying over top of the sky. But again, depending on the colors you're using, that graphite could very easily pick up on the brush. And especially if you don't paint super thick, if you do paint a little on the thinner side, that's going to pick up and gray everything out a lot sooner and a lot quicker. Now again, after I learned better with the number 2 pencils, I switched to a 4H, which does make things a little bit easier and a little bit better. You still have a little bit of pickup, but not quite as much. It is a little bit more easy to work with. You can probably see right there, it's just barely starting to pick up a little bit of that graphite. But it's not anywhere near as bad as using a darker number 2 pencil. Still have a little bit of that problem with it showing through though. Of course though, moving into the browner colors and adding our first layers on that side, even thinning that paint out. Picking up a little on the graphite, but the harder pencil also has the problem with sort of working its way into the grooves of the canvas a little too much. I know a lot of artists tend to worry a little bit about poking a hole directly through their canvas, especially with a sharper, harder leaded pencil. But in this case, we've kept our color a lot more pure, a lot more chromatic, where this grayed out a lot more with the 2H pencil. or the HB pencil rather. Now my personal preference when I approach sketching on a canvas to get things started at this point now is paint markers. Now I have this first sort of layer done with a gray paint marker, but one thing I actually will use a lot is a paint marker filled with some Titan Buff. It's an off-white, and actually for this I'm actually going to go ahead and trace over the sketch I already have a little bit, if there's any paint left in this marker, to kick that back another layer just a bit more. And whether I'm using a gray, I'm usually using gray, but especially leaning up towards the sky, I tend to use this off-white. And the best part about a paint marker is it's much easier to erase without causing yourself some problems. Just as a comparison, here's the 4H. I'm going to just scribble a little right here. Do the same thing with my number 2. Then as a result, if you make a mistake while you're on that sketching process, there's a higher probability that you're really going to smear that graphite around. And of course leave shavings of the eraser on your page, or in this case the canvas itself. It can be a lot harder to get that clean, and you're going to leave all that residue on there. Meanwhile, if you're using a paint marker, whether that be a mistake or not, coming over top of that with white before you even get started. Okay, so there's a nice fat white paint marker. You can cover up your mistakes a lot easier, so when you go into that first layer, you're not necessarily needing a lot more paint to cover it up. And just to prove this works even better, I'm going to keep my paint nice and thin here. So versus the other two where I kept the paint thicker, I'm sorry I keep bumping the camera, I can work a lot thinner on that first layer. And I can scrub on that as much as I want, and none of that's going to come up whatsoever. Now, because I'm using the gray, it is still going to show through, but I'm not smearing it. I have total control over exactly where I'm putting that color, how much is going to show through, how much is not going to show through. And that is what I have found over the years to be a much more beneficial way of starting with your first layer and starting with your initial sketch for a piece. You can use pencil, it does work, but when you take the guesswork out of doing anything with the first layer of paint, everything becomes that much easier and that much more relaxed. And it's always better to have a much more relaxed and free-form painting experience when you go into your piece. So if you're having sort of the same problems that I used to with, you know, those colors graying out and mixing in with your paint with the sketches, you can either use a lighter pencil, or my highly recommended method now is to use a paint marker, so you just flat out don't have that problem at all. So the next time you happen to be working on a painting and you're like, I don't know if I need a ton of detail right away, I don't know if I want all of that heavy graphite to mix into my paint. If you have some already, grab some paint markers or pick some up if you don't have them. I highly recommend them. Brand doesn't really matter in this particular sense because it's really just that first layer, that first sketch of your painting. But I've found that it's much more easy to work with, much more freeform, and a lot easier to make decisions on, oh, that's a mistake, let me just cover that up with white, versus coming in with, oh, an eraser the eraser shavings gumming up the canvas or sticking on the wood panel a little too much. This is a lot easier way of doing that, and without having to make all of those mistakes and have all of those problems, you can free yourself up by using paint markers on that first layer and then paint on top of that without having to worry about dragging graphite straight through your piece. So this was just a quick and simple little demo today to show you guys a piece of my process that has evolved a lot over the years. I started pretty simple, grab the number 2 pencil, sketch it out. But over the years, I found that there has been a much better way of doing that, specifically with paint markers. If you do your sketches with paint markers or have ever thought of it before, give this one a like. If you learned anything, give this one a like too. It's a really fun way to expand your horizons into painting a little bit, and especially when I get moving on a piece, especially with a relatively fresh idea, it's a way to stay a little bit more freeform without having to sit there and erase over and over again. So again, if you enjoyed this, like button's there, subscribe if you're not already. Check me out on socials in the description box below. Said the subscribe thing already. I'm all out of whack now. Thanks for watching, keep on creating, and I will see you guys next time.